The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a later confirmed murderer when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching knives and a hammer for self-protection. It was the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just got dark. It was twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend saw a man approaching us slowly. He was creeping up on us. At first, we thought it was a park ranger coming to tell us to put out our campfire. I began to hide the weed, thinking this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him. She didn't have any camping bag, nothing for camping. Why was he out here so far with no camping gear at night, with no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. The look was absent, blank, and weird. He didn't answer my boyfriend. He just kept walking right at him. Red flags going off at this point. When my boyfriend realized that it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had a concealed knife. He made it clear that he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us. He said something weird. "Oh, I was just wondering if y'all were having a party." Remember, we were miles away from a single soul, and it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a flashlight. He had no camping gear with him, just a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any answers but asked what was going on. He didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant that the guy approaching couldn't see how many people were at our site. He asked, "How many people you got with ya?" He began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and my boyfriend didn't answer. He carried on circling around our camp. Now bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. He proceeded to walk off in that direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a campsite there because of the terrain. Remember, he had no light and no bag with camp gear. Nothing. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill in the direction completely off the path. He walked for about 30 seconds, and then his footsteps stopped completely. He was just still, silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him. It was dark. At this point, I was freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a baby in front of my boyfriend. We had a talk about whether we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me a knife and said, if anything happens to me, I should run. At this point, I knew it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said that we needed to get out of there and just to grab essential items. I was scared that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. This is the type of guy who would probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to walk, kind of run down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience stuck with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason why that guy was out there that night. I've tried. Now this was the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type in Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time. And there was. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman he was with ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender, and he began to stab her. Somehow, she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of these details are the same as the guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of flashlight, same time to approach us, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realize this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We got lucky. It could have been us. This happened to me when I was 17, around the time when most of my friends were getting their driver's license. We all had that rush for cars back then, so it was quite common for us to skip school and go for a ride out of town. The city where I live is surrounded by forests and 2 mountains, so we basically had a lot of places to go and chill. One day, my friend was very excited to show us a place that he found about online, possibly here on Reddit, for which people said was quite odd. We looked it up and apparently it had a reputation for being a paranormal site. Being the typical group of teens, we collectively agreed to check it out as soon as we could, including me, who more or less believes in spiritual stuff. Going up the mountain, we were listening to the radio until we lost the station to static, which for obvious reasons is what the radio does when you go deep into the woods. This entire experience was happening during a summer night, so we were feeling pretty careless and as excited as a person can be. Having no music to listen to, we started talking and discussing our expectations for this place, with most of us having no expectations at all. Our conversation was suddenly interrupted by the loud static coming from the radio that we had turned off just a few minutes ago. We were all a bit startled, but still, nothing out of the ordinary. It happened again a few minutes later. We all looked at the radio. It was still off. We quickly dismissed this as something that radios do for some reason, and again, didn't pay much attention. The third time that it happened, the driver hit the brakes and stopped the car. He turned to us and yelled, "What the hell, did you hear that? What was that?" Claiming that he heard a voice this time. None of us heard anything except static. The driver said that he had had enough, and he switched the engine off, so there is no possible way for anything, including the radio, to be working. We sat like that for a while in pitch black, for there were no city lights around us, and the forest had covered all other light sources, like the stars and so on. The light indicating the radio turned on, and soon after, the static came. I could tell that we were all feeling a bit anxious by then. Through the static came a female voice singing, and it was very silent. For a second, it got louder, then fell back to silent again, and then it vanished. But even weirder, the static vanished too. Once we switched the car back on and turned the headlights on too, we observed what seemed to be smudges of fingers across the frickin' windshield. We didn't turn the car around immediately, but I could tell that we all just wanted to leave. We stopped further up on the hill, took some pictures of the Milky Way, and then went home afterward. Ever since, we speculate about what the hell happened to the radio in the windshield that night. My friends went 2 more times without me to the same place, recording the same stuff, including feeling a small push once the car was off. What do you guys think? I believe there are many logical explanations, but considering the fact that I'm somewhat of a person who believes in such stuff, and had an adrenaline rush that night, it's hard for me to grasp something rational. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time that we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we would stay in the woods all weekend. We had only come out for school. We loved pretending that we were frontiersmen. We would build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea is that we would walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we would find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this could be dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that no one went to. We fished. We hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we would see each other occasionally. One summer in the mid-90s, it worked out so that we both were in town for about a week. We would do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we would either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and then walk home. The day came. We started out in the early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot that we used to start, right outside of our hometown. She thought that this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we would take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a "what the hell," and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and we sat on the edge, smoking a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick, forested area, trees on every side of the train track so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought hammocks to sleep in, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We would walk the area around a little bit to make sure that some dude's house wasn't just over a hill, and we were actually camping in their backyard. We walked maybe 100 feet or so into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from the top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw that it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on the top of the place, all weathered black. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, and no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to the spot that we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears, and then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the hell out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction that we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. I'm not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. This happened back in 2004 in northern Wisconsin. I was 16 at the time and out deer hunting with my dad and a friend of his, Frank. I remember this day like it was yesterday. The dialogue isn't word for word, but the idea of it is 100% accurate. As a side note, it was one day after 8 people were shot less than 2 hours away. My dad and I had a few different stands over an area of about 3/4 of a mile. He had been hunting there for at least 10 years, and I had been going with him since I was 5. Up until I was 12, the legal age to hunt with a rifle, I had just been tagging along. This particular morning, we walked to my stand first. It was about 5 a.m., so it was still dark outside. I got situated, and my dad and Frank went off to our other 2 stands over the ridge, maybe another 500 or 600 yards away. Sitting there in the dark is always a little eerie. Not long after my dad and Frank left, I see a flashlight from the general direction of where they headed, maybe 200 yards away, roughly moving my direction. I figured they had forgot something from the truck or something, so I radioed to see what they were doing. We're sitting in my stand. Frank is about to head to the other one, he says. Obviously, the flashlight is someone else. This isn't super uncommon and really isn't a big deal. Those woods get crowded sometimes, and there is a spot to park in that general direction. I turn on my light so the other hunter can see that there is someone there. He stops. I see the light turn and go in a different direction. No big deal. I end up dozing off while it's still dark out. When I wake up, the sun is up and it's around 8 a.m. I sit there for a bit, radio my dad to see if he has heard or seen anything move. Nothing yet. A couple gunshots off in the distance is all. I get up and I go for a slow little walk to get my blood moving a bit. Not far, maybe 30 yards out and back, trying not to make a sound. I come back to my stand, sit down and take a real good look around. Nothing really going on. I finally look out to my left, where I had seen the flashlight before, and I see orange. For anyone unfamiliar, hunters have to wear blaze orange during gun season. I radio my dad and Frank to see if either one of them were moving around. Dad says no. I hear nothing from Frank. I grab the binoculars out of my backpack to see if it's Frank. It's definitely not. This guy is looking at me through his scope, rifle aimed directly at me. This is a huge no-no. Massive rule we all learn in hunter's education. Never point your rifle at something you don't intend to shoot. Dumb people still do it though. It's few and far between, but it happens. This is why normal people use binoculars. My first thought is, what a freaking dickbag. Thing is, even with me looking at him, he doesn't put his gun down. Now I'm starting to panic, thinking I'm going to be the next hunting murder victim. I slowly grab my rifle, get up, staying behind as many trees as I can, and walk down a little path to the side of my stand. My stand was on this kind of little knoll on the side of a much larger hill. I radio my dad and tell him what's up. He tells me to sit tight and stay out of sight. Obviously, as a 16-year-old, I couldn't do that and I had to keep looking. But every time I looked at the guy, he was still aiming in my direction, but was also standing in a different spot. Like I would look, go back to hiding, look again, and he would be 30 yards from where he was the last time. About 10 minutes of this goes by when my dad radios me. How you doing, bud? Looking back, he was very obviously trying to keep me calm. At the time, I thought he just wasn't taking me seriously. He's still there, but he keeps moving. I don't know what his problem is. Dad told me to just keep hidden and he'll figure it out. That he'll be coming up near me in a minute or two. And that's when I hear the shot. I lost my shit trying to get a hold of my dad. Did he just get shot? Where the hell is he? Did he have to shoot the guy? What is going on? I sit there for maybe 2 to 3 minutes that felt like hours. Alright, come on out and head towards my stand. I peek up over the little knoll I was behind and see my dad waving from along the ridge the random guy had been on. I make the trek on over to him to see what had happened. It turns out that Frank was feeling a little restless and took a little stroll and ended up on the other side of that particular ridge the stranger was on, not knowing that he was there. He had knocked his radio battery loose while he was getting situated earlier in the morning, and had no idea anything was even going on. The shot I heard was actually Frank shooting a deer. Dad said as soon as Frank shot, the guy walked off away from us towards the logging road. We helped Frank out with his deer and decided to call it an early day. Although I was extremely nervous, the rest of the week went on with no incidents. When my cousin and I were younger, we spent a great deal of time together. We would get into all sorts of mischief, as boys do. I was staying over at my aunt and uncle's visiting my cousin one weekend when we came across something that, at the time, we didn't think to bring up to anyone older and smarter than we were. We live in South Carolina for what it's worth, and we are around the ages of 12 and 8, me being the older of the two. The area around my aunt and uncle's house had some small, densely wooded areas, but overall, the area isn't anything I would consider rural. We decided to explore an area of woods across from my aunt and uncle's house, a spot that we hadn't really explored much of. Not too far from the road, we came across an old house. It wasn't in bad shape, and even had a little garden with a well enough tended flower bed. Our first thought was, reasonably enough, that we would run into someone's yard. Passing through, we noticed one of the windows to the home was broken, so we decided to peek in. There wasn't much of anything in the house. It was devoid of furniture or anything else that would imply that someone actually lived there. Naturally, we tried the doors to see if we could get in. No luck. We then heard a car pulling up to the house from the opposite side of us. My cousin and I darted for the tree line and followed some power lines into the nearby woods. A large section of the woods here had been cleared out to allow for the power lines to be where they were. So, picture a clearing of around 100 or so feet, surrounded by woods on either side. After following the power lines for quite a bit, we got hit by the unmistakable smell of something dead. We kept on and noticed a wooden tower standing off the side through the woods a bit. We excitedly hurried to investigate it. On the way, we found a dead dog. That would explain the smell, and it wasn't too unusual. And then we found another and another. Surrounding the entire stand were the corpses of dead dogs. It had to be over 30 carcasses. They were all in varying states of decay. Some seemed only a few days old. Some were nothing but bones. We were alarmed but still dumb kids and wanted to climb to the top, so we did. At the top, we found even more dog carcasses. So, process this. Not only were there bodies of dead dogs surrounding this tower stand, someone had put forth the effort to drag them some 30 feet up a slim ladder to the top. Unsettled, we made our way back to my aunt and uncle's after that. We never mentioned it to anyone, or at least I never did. Thinking back on it 15 years later, we definitely should have said something. I've tried looking up similar things in the area, but I haven't had any luck. We never went back there after finding that horrible scene. I also wouldn't conclude that the house we found or the person that showed up there are in any way related to the tower stand. That's just how our story began. I went to summer camp in a rural part of New Jersey back in the mid-1990s. The camp was situated on a long, narrow, man-made lake. One end of the lake was reserved for swimming, which we would do as a group activity every other day or so. The swimming area had one long dock stretching straight out into the water, and 2 square floating docks further out. One of the 2 floating docks was a bit far away, and although I had spent a few summers at this camp at the time of the incident, I had never seen anyone else using the second dock. One day, our group of about a dozen 11-year-olds got the bright idea that we were going to swim out to the faraway dock. I would consider this to be a moderate challenge for a casual swimmer. When we reached the dock, I noticed a strange-looking spider on the ladder that you had to use to climb up. It was quite large in terms of overall footprint, probably around 2 inches from end to end, with long, skinny legs. Spiders, of course, are normal critters to encounter in nature, but this one stood out to me because of its unusual appearance. After the long swim, we took a few minutes to lie on the dock and rest in the sun. It was relaxing and we were all having a good time. We started messing around and decided to play one of our regular games where we would all shuffle towards the corner of the dock, causing it to sink. As the corner of the dock started to sink and fill with water, suddenly hundreds of giant spiders came frantically pouring out from between the boards, swarming over and around the feet of those of us who were still standing on dry ground. This dock was theirs apparently. We all immediately began to scream and jump into the water trying to get away, but the spiders were in the water too, and stuck to us as we swam. I vividly remember the feeling of them clinging to my wet hair, fleshy bodies and long squirming legs, hopelessly intertwined with my own strands. Adrenaline propelled us back into the main part of the swimming area, and by the time we got there, thankfully we were spider-free. But this is a childhood trauma that lingers with me. I hadn't really been afraid of spiders before, but I would say that this was a major turning point. thought of us lying on the dock in the sun, completely oblivious to the horror that was lurking just inches beneath us. It creeps me out to this day. I posted this as a comment in a different thread, and it made me think of this. Brought back the memory of this awful camping experience, and also why we don't camp outside of well-populated campgrounds anymore. The woods are safe. It's the people that you have to worry about. The one instance that I will never forget, though, was a man that just showed up at our group camping site, also miles away from any actual campground, and watched us behind different trees from a distance. A few of us said hello, but he wouldn't answer. Yet when he saw the kids, he tried to talk to them repeatedly. We were a big group of adults, but since we had children with us, some of the guys finally went over and confronted him. He claimed not to be watching us, and he walked away. Then later that night, he pulled up in a beat-up RV and parked, blacking us in, right next to our makeshift group site. The RV itself was bizarre and creepy. He had children's underwear in the dash, toys and junk piled up, and so on. It was getting dark and we were all around the fire when he suddenly walks up and stands in our little circle. He made a comment right off the bat that all the little ones went to bed already, which freaked me out immediately. The guys asked him to leave semi-nicely, not knowing what his deal was. About a half hour later, I could see him standing off behind a tree smoking. I couldn't see him, but I saw the end of his cigarette. He just watched and chain-smoked. It was unnerving. In the middle of nowhere, being watched by a man who seemed so focused on our kids. Not to mention that, out of the 3 other families we were with, my family of 4 was the only one in a tent, which didn't feel as safe as an RV or camper with him there. I went to bed when our 2 kids did, so they weren't alone. Our tent was on the further side of the site, away from the fire. Shortly after the kids fell asleep, I heard crunching in the woods around the tent and called my husband's name, thinking he was stumbling in the dark looking for our tent door. When he didn't answer, I unzipped the door and shined the light around, right across the feet of the creepy guy. I instantly jumped up and started yelling. All the guys came running from the fire. The creepy guy just stood there and stared at us, didn't explain himself, not that he would have a good reason, and then he turned and walked away. I was beyond done. We packed up our stuff and crammed it in the car, pleading with our friends to leave, but they wouldn't. I was the only adult there that hadn't been drinking, so no one could drive home. I drove home so awake and on high alert all the way. Our friends that stayed did have guns, and they all had secure campers and RVs to sleep in. They came home the next night and had even more bizarre encounters with the creep. Each of us did contact the authorities, by the way. This did not happen to me, but I live in the area where it took place. As far as I know, this is not a made-up story. My friend and I were discussing these scary things that we've seen in the woods, and he told me a story that happened to his friend. This guy was with 5 of his friends who were spending a few days in a cabin hunting and trapping. They were not drunk, but they had a few beers to unwind one night. So, one of them goes out to the outhouse to go to the bathroom, and he swears that off in the woods, he hears the faint sound of a drum beating. He finishes in the outhouse and goes into the cabin to tell his friends to come out and check out the sound. They all grab their rifles and walk out of the ridge their cabin was on, and down the hollow behind it and back up the other side. It was a pretty rocky area, so the sound traveled far, and they could tell that just over the hill was where the sound was coming from. 5 of them spread out about 50 feet apart and walked up to the top. They couldn't see down or over because of all the laurel bushes around them. So, the 5 of them waited, and one went to sneak down to see what it was. When he got there, he stood and watched for about 30 seconds to a minute, before he turned around and went to his friends as fast as he could, telling them he saw evil, and they had to get the hell out of there right then. All he would tell them is that he saw a bunch of naked men and women dancing around in a circle chanting something in a foreign language. He never told them about everything he saw. The guy who told my friend this story was one of the guys who hung back, and he didn't see what happened. Whatever it was, I'm glad we didn't stay there much longer. I went to college in Moorhead, Kentucky, and this was back in 2017, I think. There are these old mining caves called the Mushroom Mines, and they aren't in use anymore, but it was a hotspot for spooks and exploring. People always say crazy stuff goes down there, like rituals and so on, but I only believe the occasional drug deal or something. Someone said the police found a goat cut in half down the center of its face, but I never saw evidence of that, so I don't believe it even today. Me, my friend Teddy, and my boyfriend at the time decided to go to the caves around 2 or 3 p.m. one afternoon after class. I can't remember who, but I think we had 1 or 2 other friends with us. Maybe Teddy's friend, because I honestly can't remember. When we got there, there was another car parked outside of the caves, and it seemed like it didn't belong to anyone crazy. It was a lime green little thing, clean as what we could see with the windows rolled down. Maybe because it was hot as hell outside at the time. No one was around that we could see though. That wasn't really weird because there were a lot of hiking trails next to the cave, and no one was in the mouth of the cave, so we assumed they must be hiking. We were exploring the mouth of the cave, and only going maybe 10 to 20 feet deep. This was because if you've ever been to a mine or deep cave before that isn't in use, you know it's pitch freaking black and it's cold. We did have flashlights, but we still weren't trying to go a mile in or anything. All of a sudden, Teddy just asked us, "Did you guys see that?" This immediately sent chills down my spine, and I think he was just trying to scare us. My boyfriend goes to where he's standing and asks what he saw. As Teddy is explaining that he thinks he saw a small light come on down the cave, way deeper down. A small light clicks on way further than we are down the cave, as if reacting to his acknowledgement. It was a light from a flashlight. It clicks back off and we take a second, and we get the hell out of there. So guys, I don't know what to think of this all. They didn't have their light on when we first showed up, so they were what? Just hanging out there in the dark? They didn't say hi to us or speak at all, and it's weird that it seems like they almost tried to get one of our attention, instead of again just calling out and greeting us all. They also had no idea we were coming, or that anyone would be coming. We had all skipped our afternoon classes, so most students wouldn't even be there until 5 or 6 to explore. Please tell me what you all think. I haven't gone back since. Obviously, I don't think it was a monster or a ghost, but if anything, people freak me out more. Especially ones who hang out in old mines alone with no light. My dad grew up on forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life, we've spent a lot of time out in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel, and only occasionally. One place that Dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the forest that was impossible to find if you didn't know the way. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades up until the 90s, and had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in bars who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm and hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forest, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated, but the vibe was always the same. That straight up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place where we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. But Dad didn't seem concerned. One trip when I was a teenager, it got really strange really quick. My friends and I were all piled into my dad's 4x4, and we were driving through the bush to Spike so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property, and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite Spike's hut, there was what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log, hat over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way that you would be sad if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of a workday. And even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of on the property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us out of the car at Spike's as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing but that if the figure was still there when we came back through, we would stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up, as he just drove through the forest a bit. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped over cowboy again, never having moved an inch, still in that same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of his promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me. He locked the truck doors and drove off the farm much faster than he ever drove on those dirt forest roads. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile at best, dangerous at worst. Dad denied that any of the events of that day ever happened after that, but my friends and I were still really curious about what was going on out there. So, a few months later, we went camping on our own and set out to find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it without Dad's help. Something was off once we got there, more so than usual that day though. My mates jumped out of the car but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut, for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I had spent 2 hours finding the place and I was going to explore it. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants with knowing nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but we were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back any minute, or that they had never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of a small shed with 3 walls. I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill made from crosshatched wire sitting over the fire, hinged to the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I figured that whoever had been there had been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever actually. But then my stomach dropped. As my eyes traveled down the grill to the ground, I saw a baby sock. Tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. And then another, and then a shirt, and then a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off and I rounded up my mates to get the heck out of there. Some ranger or crazy old bushy hanging out at that trash top was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there, and there's no way anything good had come of having a child's clothing right by a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our stuff and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing persons in the area in an attempt to explain either the cowboys or the kids' clothing. But I can tell you that I would never make the mistake of going out to Spike's without my father again. Let's start with a little backstory. I'm a 24-year-old female that fell in love with national parks, so much so that I decided to work full-time on one for about 3 years. This experience allowed me to meet some great people, but it also welcomed some sketchy individuals. This particular story starts with a man that we'll call Sam. Sam was a tall man with a shaved head and glasses. He was the kind of coworker that would always linger awkwardly. He made everyone feel uncomfortable, but not enough to warrant any concern. The only issue that I really noticed was that he seemed like he had a drinking problem. He would show up to work still drunk, and he would have to be sent home somewhat regularly. He seemed innocent though, in a socially awkward way. I only worked with him for a few months before I was transferred to another location, and I was offered a pay raise. A few months after starting the new position, I was in the employee break room browsing my newsfeed when I received 5 messages within a 3-minute time span. I didn't even realize people could type that fast. The messages were from Sam. Something that caught me off guard because I had never spoken to him outside of my last position. The messages consisted of vague threats regarding my friends and myself. He seemed upset to find out that I had certain friends and thought that I was tainted from association. I was less upset at his foul perception of me and more pissed that he had targeted my friends, who were truly lovely people. I am bad when it comes to taking the high road, and I decided to give this man a piece of my mind. We weren't friends, hardly acquaintances, so I didn't feel that his behavior was appropriate, and quite frankly, I was angry. Through our exchange, the original rude context of the messages became obviously threatening. He told me that I should die along with my friends, and that he would be more than happy to end our misery. I was shocked. His anger didn't make sense to me, and I realized that I wasn't going to reason with this lunatic, so I decided to get HR involved. We worked within the same company, so I thought this would be the best route to prevent any further harassment. HR advised me to block contact from him while they investigate, but to also alert authorities in case he decided to act out on his threats. Authorities were involved and didn't seem too fazed by the messages that I had showed them. They almost seemed annoyed that I had bothered calling them in the first place. I filled out a statement and was told to contact them if anything progressed. The next day, I woke up to find trash all over my front steps. Odd, but not too strange. I actually thought it was a raccoon since I was in a national park. And then I saw a piece of paper with the words, "Watch your back," scribbled onto it. I looked around the other neighboring cabins to see if anybody else was watching, but I didn't see anyone. I cleaned up the mess, but I saved the note. I wanted to show my sister who lived with me. When she got home later that morning, I caught her up on the previous night's events. She didn't even know Sam because, like I said, we weren't friends. Why would I mention him in my personal life? I gave her a brief description of him in case she saw him lurking around, and I headed to work. Halfway through my shift, I get a call from Alexa. She sounds shaken when she tells me that a man matching Sam's description came to our cabin and asked about me and where I was. She played dumb and pretended to not even know who I was. After an awkward silence, he said, "I'll be back to get her later," and he walked away. She said that he sounded and acted like he had been heavily drinking and had an intense coldness to him. I'm not messing around at this point and have watched enough crime shows to know that you should not underestimate people. So, I called the company's security team and asked to have someone check on my sister and to be escorted home immediately. I'm home within 20 minutes of her phone call. She gave security some more information and they were able to find out which cabin that he resided in. Apparently, he only lived about a 2-minute walk down our street, which was really unnerving. Park rangers are called again, and they get more statements from both of us and decide to pay him a visit. They seem to be taking the situation a bit more seriously now that he knows where I live. They come back after talking to his roommate. It's confirmed that he lives there, but he hasn't been home since the night before. Authorities put a word out to keep an eye out for Sam. They offered to have a unit keep an eye on us that night, which we gladly accept, and we go to bed. I wake up to 34 messages from an unknown number. It was Sam again. He was very angry that I got HR and other rangers involved. He said, "You're going to pay for this. You messed with the wrong person. I'll end you." I email HR and present them screenshots of the messages and texts. I demand that they resolve this immediately and want to set up a meeting with the director to discuss termination. You see, in national parks when you're hired, the company provides cheap housing on site, and when you're fired, you have to leave the national park boundary within 24 hours. So, I thought this would solve a majority of the issues. They seemed to agree with me and tried to locate Sam for a meeting. No one had seen him since the first messages began 2 days prior, so the park is on a manhunt. The park is huge, and it's easy to hide if you don't want to be found. Thankfully though, his roommate alerted officials when Sam stumbled home drunk the next day. They're able to speak with him and sober him up enough to take him to the HR building a couple of hours later. After the meeting, I'm notified that he had been given a first and final write-up and will continue to work and live on my street. He apparently gave a sob story about his personal issues and promises to leave me alone. I was baffled that even with him threatening to kill me, they weren't going to fire him. Thankfully, the other rangers were equally surprised and still offered to provide surveillance just in case. It was quiet for 3 days. I thought it was actually over and I started to feel bad for Sam actually. I thought maybe he was just going through some stuff and I was just his mental punching bag. I didn't agree with it, but I no longer felt as threatened, if that makes sense. That was until I received a knock on my door and I opened it to find 2 rangers waiting to speak with me. According to the rangers and a few people from the HR department, Sam's roommate had to call the emergency line when Sam started acting bizarre after the meeting and tried to convince him to lure me into a secluded place so Sam could take care of me. Thankfully, his roommate wasn't a psycho and reported the situation immediately once Sam went to the bathroom. Rangers were on site within minutes and had restrained Sam in order to search their cabin for evidence. They ended up finding a loaded firearm and a suspected suicide note that stated he was going to kill me and take his own life. There was plenty of evidence for the case and he was successfully banned from all national parks in the United States. I have since moved to a different state and have changed my contact information. He has since contacted me once to brag about how much I helped him secure unemployment benefits, which I quickly shared with officials. According to officials, he was restricted to a southern Arizona county due to other crimes that he had later committed, and that I shouldn't worry about him finding me. As for HR, the director actually had to deal with harassment from Sam after the banning and asked me to testify on her behalf if it turned into something more sinister. I haven't heard anything since, so I'm assuming she found another way to stop his assault. I don't understand why he decided to target me. We hadn't had very many interactions even at work. I have tried to dig through memories to find a single time that I may have invited this kind of behavior, but I'm convinced it was due to many factors, including his instability and alcoholism. I was a wildland fighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern portion, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to work for it. The fire crew I was on had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out of, and one that was about 2.5 hours away up a really windy, mountainous road. The report duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station, and a new double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, I had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which sadly made people play on their phones, but I digress. So, for my story, I want to keep it pretty simple, but my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things as well as working up there. There was one night he told me he was cowboy camping, sleeping outside with no tent, and he kept getting a weird mucusy drop of liquid on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me that he wasn't below any trees, so it wasn't tree sap. He never slept outside there ever again, which leads me to believe that he was telling the truth. Now for my story. I've had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of July 4th, and we weren't on duty, so the crew was playing horseshoes and having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to have a PT hike the next day. I had my own small room in the double-wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started dozing off, but I felt awake still, and I hear one of my coworkers outside my window asking me to come outside. I was laying on my side facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their presence by the window. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from outside. They kept beckoning me, and I said no. Pretty quickly, their voice started changing to a deeper, raspier, angrier voice. They started cursing at me. "Get outside!" I just froze. It was sort of a demonic voice. I lay frozen, not moving while they yelled at me. Eventually, it finally stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my coworker if he was standing outside my window, but I felt too weird. Perhaps this was just a mild form of sleep paralysis, but I'm not so sure. A little bit of background about myself. I've worked my entire adult life in the Pacific Northwest woods. Over 15 years in total, with about 7 years of that being for the Park Service at Olympic National Park. Many experiences over the years could warrant the title of creepy, but this one in particular has always stuck with me. While working for the Park Service, one of my jobs was that of a restoration carpenter. We would travel to old, backcountry historical cabins, emergency shelters, homesteads, and chalets, tasked with repairing and restoring them to their original historic, accurate states. This was a wonderful and demanding job. I had spent 8 days at the time living off the beaten path, usually deep in the backcountry. Sometimes we would be flown in supplies. Sometimes we would use llamas or mules to pack our gear, all the while sleeping in thinly walled single tents, cooking over a fire or a whisper-light stove, using these same tools and techniques the original homesteaders had at their disposal in the late 1800s to construct and survive in this unforgiving environment. One late fall, I was assigned to work near Lake Ozette at an old homestead off the trail, near the constructed boardwalk. For those unfamiliar with the area, Lake Ozette is 8 miles long and 3 miles wide. It sits as the largest unaltered national lake in Washington. Lake Ozette has a long and rich history of Native American culture. The Maka Tribal Center in Nia Bay houses discoveries found in the area dating back 2,000 years, along with a local village that was well preserved over 300 years ago by a mudslide that left most of the artifacts intact. The Ozette Loop Trail, which the homestead was directly adjacent to, is approximately 9.4 miles through and through. The man-made boardwalk takes you under giant cedar groves, meanders through huge patches of chest-high salal, before delivering you to Alstrom's Prairie, about 2.5 miles from the trailhead. Alstrom's Prairie, a giant, soggy meadow, was once farmed by 2 Swedish immigrants. They constructed a small cabin and some outbuildings on the 150-acre bog. With cattle, sheep, vegetable gardens, and the help of a little Swedish ingenuity, they managed to etch out lives for themselves here for over 50 years. Over time, the forest, as it always does, decided to take back what was once its own. The now decades-long abandoned farm was hardly recognizable. Our job was to beat back the encroaching forest, put new windows in the main cabin, pipe in a new stove, apply fresh paint, and fix up portions of the semi-dilapidated barn. The ultimate goal being to allow guided tours to take place sometime in the future. For about 3 weeks, we stayed at the Ozette bunkhouse while working at Alstrom's. This was good duty for us. We weren't sleeping under the rain, our beds were warm. Our hike was short and the terrain not difficult. We even had a TV. The bunkhouse was located near the highway and the ranger station. We would hike the 5-mile loop every day, bringing with us boards, tools, paint, and everything else that we needed on our backs. These were full 10-plus hour days, usually starting our morning hike around 7 a.m. and beginning our evening return hike back to the bunkhouse around 5 p.m. At one point during the fall, there were 4 of us working this project, but at the time of this event, there was only 2 of us remaining. Most of the hard work had already been finished. We needed to hike a few last boards into the prairie to complete a portion of the woodshed before we called the job done. I volunteered to be the pack mule for the day, my only job being to carry as many boards as I could muster in each trip to the prairie before returning to the ranger station for the next load. It was late in the season for hikers at this point. The weather had turned and we had been lucky to see 2 to 3 people a day doing the loop. After around my 4th or 5th trip, I was pretty wiped out. It was getting late in the evening now, around 4 p.m., and my coworker had called it a day. I thought I could get one more trip in before it got too dark, my rationale being the more trips I did today, the less I would have to do tomorrow. We passed on the trail. I told him my intentions and I continued on. I delivered the last of the boards for the day, took a look around the prairie as the sun started to tuck behind the trees, and I started my hour hike back to the ranger station. The lighting on the boardwalk was quite low at this point, the cedars blocking most of the ambient light left by the setting sun and making visibility quite diminished. I'm not a nervous hiker, and I fail to spook easily. Having solo hiked for weeks on end in the backcountry, I've been stalked by cougars, confronted by Kodiak bears in Alaska, even ran into a few demented hillbillies over the years. As I left the prairie that evening, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Goosebumps erupted from my forearms. An uneasy feeling swept over me. Suddenly, I wanted to walk faster, jog, and then sprint. I didn't. I convinced myself that I had been reading too many fantasy novels before bedtime. I walked another 5 minutes or so before I started to hear something faint. Something that sounded like music. Impossible, I told myself. I'm the only one out here, and still at least 2 miles from civilization. That civilization in reality being like the only other soul out there, my coworker. Sure enough, however, I heard music. More specifically, a piano. It started out so faint that I had to stop moving and actually try to hear it. The steps on the wooden boardwalk being too loud. Every time I paused to hear it, it became unmistakable. It got louder. I stood there, the sun now fully hidden behind the horizon, in total silence other than this piano. I became aware that there were no longer the noise of life, no birds, no insects, no wind, no rustling of leaves or underbrush, absolutely nothing other than the piano. As if everything was being weighted down by a fog of emptiness of some sort. I've encountered this dead time before in the woods. Certain places have it, but this was different somehow, unique to this place, unique to this moment in time. I tried to focus on the keys, but I could not recognize the composition. Unsurprising, as I mostly listened to Metallica and Korn at the time. It was playing with a purpose. It was controlled, in tune, thoughtful. It was a song, and somehow I felt that it was meant just for me in this moment. I started walking again. Almost on cue, the music once again got louder. As my pace increased, so did the tempo of my keys. Still in tune, never faltering. It reached a climax, the perfect combination of my haste, my dread, my heartbeat, and the tempo of the music. And then as quickly as it came, the piano stopped, whooshed away in the fraction of a moment. It didn't trail off, it didn't fade into extinction. It was just gone. Suddenly, everything that was absent was swept away as if by a gust of wind. The stillness was gone. The gloom, the stagnation, and weight of everything was lifted. My next step on the boardwalk was once again in reality. The evening was just as absent of light as before, but it felt like life somehow was once again injected back into the forest. The woods never seemed normal again. I didn't hear the piano again that night, nor since. I told my coworker every detail when I had reached the bunkhouse. He showed no signs of disbelief. We didn't talk about it again until years later, when something similar happened to another Park Service employee. When I told my grandfather about what had happened, as he was also a retired park ranger who had worked nearby Amora, the next station over. Without the least bit of hesitation, he asked, "Did you hear the bagpipes along with it, or just the piano this time?" It seems, as I've learned and experienced since then, there's a lot more to that place, a lot more to the Olympics in general, than anyone really knows or is willing to admit.